Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Kristen Shaverdian. I'm the Program Director for Campus Free Speech at PEN America. PEN America is a nonprofit organization that stands at the intersection of literature and human rights to protect open expression in the United States and worldwide. Our Campus Free Speech project provides educational programming, workshops, and resources for campuses as they seek to uphold freedom of expression and academic freedom while also supporting diverse and inclusive campuses. More information can be found at pen.org. We're thrilled to partner with the UC National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement for this panel, Campus Protest, Then and Now. I want to particularly thank Melanie Zement and Michelle Deutschman for their partnership, as well as my colleague at PEN America, Paris Tishabe. And of course, thank you for all of our panelists today.
Hi, I'm Michelle Deutschman. I'm the Executive Director at the UC National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement. And I just wanted to add my welcome and thanks to my colleagues at PEN America and also to Melanie Zement and our panelists. For those of you that don't know, the UC Center explores the intersection of expression, engagement, and democratic learning and considers what can be done to restore trust in the value of free speech on campuses and in society at large. A topical and timely mission. I am super excited about our program today. I'm going to introduce you to our moderator, Spoma Jovanovic, and I'm really proud to share that both Spoma and Emerson have been fellows at the Center's fellowship program. A little bit about Spoma. She's a professor emerita from the Department of Communication Studies at UNC Greensboro. For more than 20 years, she focused on collaborating with community members to ensure free speech, support student activism, and civic actions for democracy and social justice. She earned her MA and PhD in Human Communication Studies from the University of Denver and her BA from UCLA. She serves on the board of directors for Deep Roots Market, Greenboro's local co-op, and the North Carolina American Association of University Professors. And she's fabulous. And she is going to kick things off, introduce our other panelists, and then we're going to get into our conversation.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. And thanks everybody for being here to PEN America and of course the National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement. It is an explosive topic that we have on tap today, one that's capturing global attention. So we're here to discuss what has become a challenging situation, right, regarding our nation's action in a global conflict where students are at the front of protest action. We have two esteemed colleagues with us today who are going to provide more context and detail around how these campus protests should be viewed. But before we get to them, let me provide a brief overview of current events as related to these campus protests. So we know that on October 7th of last year, Hamas, in an unprecedented surprise attack, killed 1,200 Israelis and took 130 hostages. Israel's response was swift, launching its own bombardment of the Gaza Strip. Tragedy has gripped the region, and we have been witnesses to it, and our students have. According to the World Health Organization, as of just last week, more than 30,000 Palestinians have been killed, and 1,500 Israeli and foreign nationals have also died. 10,000 people are missing, presumably under rubble, and there are still more than 100 hostages that are being held by Hamas. So on campuses, it was April 17th that Columbia University students amplified their protest efforts surrounding the Israel-Hamas war. Previously, they'd been taking numerous but smaller actions calling for divestment, among other demands. Their Gaza Solidarity encampment erected on campus has since become a global movement involving, listen to this, more than 200 campuses in 25 countries and 45 of our US 50 states. And in that past month, 3,000 students, faculty, and staff have been arrested. More have been suspended, expelled, and fired at campuses across the country. You know that some campuses moved into lockdown mode, others canceled commencement speakers and campus-wide graduations. Some administrators successfully negotiated with student protesters, and others called in law enforcement to disband protests and encampments when they felt they had no other options. I'm just almost done. Those criticizing the pro-Palestinian campus actions, including New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman, say that he was saying that students failed to acknowledge that Hamas triggered the war and that Israel has the right to self-defense, and that many Palestinians detest the autocratic rule of Hamas. Still, other critics point to the protesters' anti-Semitic remarks and actions as egregious and frightening, unbefitting, frankly, of higher education culture. There are those standing with the student protesters, though, and those include the American Association of University Professors that issued a strong statement of support of free speech in the pursuit of truth, urging campuses to respond with education engagement, not punishment. And separately, more than 200 organizations, including Veterans for Peace, Greenpeace, the California Green New Deal Coalition, and the Center for Constitutional Rights have likewise publicly supported the students and condemned the police and militarized responses that we've seen on some campuses. So students are expressing moral outrage. Faculty want to support their students, both those protesting and those not. And administrators want to protect their institution's reputation and funding and ensure campus safety. These different perspectives inevitably surface competing values. And so today we'll talk more about what has been happening, ask what we have learned so far, and consider where do we go from here. To help put these recent events in further context, we'll hear first from Dr. Gregory Wilson, a professor of history at the University of Akron and co-author of Above the Shots, an oral history of the Kent State shootings. And we'll also hear from Emerson Sykes, senior staff attorney for the ACLU, on how we can best view today's campus protests and the rights of students. Okay, so first, Greg. Since many are comparing what's happening today to the events at Kent State in 1979, can you talk briefly about what happened at Kent State then, for those who may not know that history, as well as maybe the lingering effects?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And thanks for everyone for attending today and organizing. Yeah, so it was 1970, not 1979, but that's okay. But so, yeah, what I'll do is just provide a little bit of context and give everybody a very short background to what happened at Kent and the aftermath. And then, we can certainly expand that from beyond that. So, so looking back into that period, the free speech movement at Berkeley in 1964-65 really energized students into political action in that era. And that action really helped break down the barriers that were against free speech on campuses, which allowed more activism as the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War accelerated in the 1960s. Activism at Kent State itself also had grown quite a bit during the 1960s. So 1969, we had millions of people taking part in marches against the war across the nation. Anti-war protests continued into 1970. And then on April 30th, President Nixon announced that the United States military had invaded Cambodia, which inflamed the anti-war movement even more. So the next day, which was Friday, May 1st, there were protests on campuses across the country in reaction to Nixon's announcement the day before. At Kent, there were a group of protesters, around maybe 200, perhaps 500, who had gathered on campus in the Commons area. And they protested the announcement, the escalation of the war, and they buried a copy of the Constitution as a symbolic effort showing that Nixon had destroyed the Constitution. So, and then they called for a meeting, another rally at noon on Monday, May 4th to decide what to do next, whether there'd be a campus strike or continue the protest. So that night on May 1st, there was violence in downtown Kent. There was property damage to businesses, confrontations between students and police. The next day on Saturday, rumors began to spread, which again, we see a lot of similar things today. Rumors spread throughout Kent, throughout the downtown on campus, that there were outside agitators, radicals coming in to destroy the town, set off bombs. There was supposedly a plot to taint the Kent water supply with LSD, storing weapons, all kinds of things. So there was a lot of fear and uncertainty in that moment on Saturday. The big event that day was the burning of the ROTC building on campus. At this point, the mayor of Kent called in the National Guard. So that's how they arrived in that area. And they arrived to see the building on fire. They went to campus. They broke up the gathering of students that was there with tear gas, bayonets, pushed everyone back into the dorms on that Saturday night. The university officials did not request that the Guard be on campus. However, the Guard asserted their right to be there anyway. And so that was a point of contention throughout this period. The next day, Sunday, was a day of dichotomies. The day was dawned with calm. The students and the Guard were fraternizing together on campus. The thing that really sparked things, escalated things, was a speech by the governor at that point, which was James Rhodes of Ohio. He delivered a fiery speech where he claimed the protests were largely the work of outside agitators moving from campus to campus. He likened protesters to Nazi brown shirts, communists, the Ku Klux Klan. He said they're the worst type of people we harbor in America. And so that escalated things even further. The widespread assumption was that martial law had been declared, which it had not. University officials then announced on Sunday that all rallies, whether peaceful or not, would be banned, that the Guard had taken over campus. Campus, though, remained open for classes. And so on Monday, May 4th, there would be classes being held that day. Sunday night was another night of violence, more confrontations between National Guard now and students. Again, tear gas, bayonets used to break up the rally, push students back into their dorms on that evening. So all of that is kind of pretext to what happened on Monday, May 4th. Classes, as I said, were going on. The called for rally that was to be held began despite what had happened earlier on Saturday and Sunday. The rally now was really as much about the Guard being on campus as it was about the Vietnam War. So the crowd that assembled there, it's hard to know for sure, maybe about 1,500 to 2,000 students were there to demonstrate in some form. There were thousands more students just seeing what was happening. There were other students who were just there to go to class, right? Because again, classes were held on that Monday. So what happened that day is the National Guard was on one end of the Commons near the burned out remains of the ROTC building. On the other end of the Commons were the protesters, and they were up on a hill called Blanket Hill. And at the top of Blanket Hill is a journalism building called Taylor Hall. And that's where the site of the next violence would occur. So at about 11:30 or so, the National Guard moved out to break up this rally. They had announced that it was illegal. Students ignored it. And so they moved out again with tear gas. They had weapons. They had M1 rifles, which are military rifles, World War II era. They had shotguns. They had pistols. And of course, they had tear gas as well. All of this, of course, was with live ammunition. So at 11:30, the Guard moved out. They began to push the students up and over Blanket Hill. And when they got to one side of Blanket Hill, the Guard stopped. The students ran as the Guard moved. Most of the students were over in a parking lot, hundreds of feet away. Shouts were made. Tear gas was, shot. Students threw rocks. The Guard threw rocks back. Students grabbed tear gas canisters and threw them at the Guard. The Guard grabbed them and threw them back. So this was going on as that march was happening. And then after about 10 minutes or so, part of the Guard, Troop G, Company A, they began to move back up over the hill. And then as they reached the crest of that Blanket Hill, you probably are familiar with a lot of the photographs here. That's when members of Troop G turned, fired into the students. They fired 67 shots, 13 seconds, and they killed 4 students and wounded 9 others. After that, the Guard then proceeded back down the hill, back towards the ROTC building. At that moment, there was an intervention by faculty. Glenn Frank in particular averted what might have been an even larger tragedy, because the students were now angry, the Guard was angry, and there could have been an even bloodier confrontation had something happened in that moment. But the faculty convinced students to break up, and eventually they left. Campus was then shut down over most of the summer at that point. So after that, responses were varied. Across the nation, most newspapers, media outlets expressed shock at what had happened, right? The Guard had shot students. Right after that, there was a massive wave of student strikes, protests. 4 million students went on strike, shut universities down across the country in the wake of the Kent State shootings. Inside Kent, though, townspeople expressed their view, which was in support of the Guard. They wrote into the newspaper saying it's about time. They asked for it. They should have shot more of them, things like this. So a division right away over the events. On May 8th, just a few days later, the infamous Hard Hat riot occurred in New York City, where construction workers and office workers attacked student protesters who were in New York City demonstrating against the war and what had happened at Kent. So the killings, though, at Kent weren't the first nor the only students that were shot by authorities. In February of '68, 3 Black students were killed by police and state patrol at South Carolina State. 10 days after Kent, at Jackson State College, now university, 2 Black students were killed by police and state patrol then. So court trials happened. Excuse the noise outside here. Court trials against the Guardsmen went forward, but they ended in an out-of-court settlement. During the trials, the Guardsmen claimed self-defense. They were being fired on. They claimed there was a sniper. No one was ever convicted of the shootings. There was a statement, though, that was signed by the Guard as an expression of regret at what happened, but not an apology or admission of wrongdoing. For many years, Kent State itself, the administration tried to kind of bury what had happened. They were resistant to celebrating it. But in the intervening years, really since the 1990s, the university has kind of embraced this event and used it as a moment to try to teach about civil disobedience, free speech, what that means in a democracy. So they've taken it, turned it, I guess, in that direction. So, and now there's a museum and a walking tour as well. So, all right,
Great.
so that's enough on Kent. Thank you. So,
Good. So
Yeah.
let me just interrupt you for 1 second.
Oh,
And
sure, that's enough. Yeah, for me.
Yeah, and first of all, I do want to apologize about saying 1979. I know it's
That's okay.
1970. You know what? It's like in my own, we all have it in my own city, and I wrote a book about it. We had a big event in 1979, so it was the Greensboro massacre, and it's seared in my mind and had a lot of similar features for Kent State, different circumstances and context, but a lot of the same law enforcement issues, which I'm sure happen all over the country. But let me ask you so that we can. This is just so fascinating, and again, I think a lot of people don't, some people weren't born that are probably on this call about what happened at Kent State. But I understand even now, students are quite active at Kent State in this most current issue. So how do you see activism on campuses today, even on your own campus, similar to or maybe different from the legacy of what Kent State has to offer us?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think in terms of numbers, I think we're seeing less now over the Israel-Gaza conflict than we did in the 1960s. So I think that's certainly a difference. I think, but certainly there's as you mentioned already, a growing number, right, of students who are active just in this past month or so. I think what is also different in terms of context is campuses now are trying to open up with free speech, but at the same time try to keep campus safe, right, for a diverse number of students. So they're juggling these things. What we see now that's, I think, different as well is the militarization of local police forces, which is different than what we had in, say, the late 60s, early 70s. So, and that's providing, I think, a different context. So too is, the rise of right-wing activism, right? That's accelerated in recent years. And I think that's playing into these tensions, which are feeding right into the specific conflict. So, and I think the last thing that seems similar, but maybe a little bit different too, is that I think for college students, the state of higher education is in a different place than it was in the late 60s, early 70s. We're seeing attacks on higher education generally, cutting back of programs, all of these different things that are questioning the value of education and really democracy too. So to me, those stakes are different, right, than what we had in the 60s and early 70s there. So those are just a few ideas. Yeah.
To be sure. Great. Thanks, Greg.
Sure.
Again, a lot of interesting and provocative points that I'd like for us to delve into in a little bit more. But before we do that, let's turn to Emerson so we can get him on, and then we'll leave lots of room for questions and answers. And people from the audience, if you have something you want to pose, please let us know. So let's turn to Emerson Sykes. He's a senior staff attorney, as I mentioned, with the ACLU, and he focuses on First Amendment free speech protections. He's been quite active in working with students, certainly prior to what we are seeing now, on how to be engaged citizens, which oftentimes involves protest, of course. So Emerson, can you start us off here by explaining the differences between civil disobedience and protest from a legal perspective, and maybe distinguishing between, as we were hearing about what happened at Kent State, between nonviolent action and violence, when protest often involves both, and how do we characterize them, or what do we do when some line has been crossed, either by the students or by those at Kent State, National Guard, or law enforcement more generally. So yeah, kind of the landscape of what students are facing and what we are watching on these protests.
Sure. Thanks very much, Spoma. And thanks to the hosts. I'm a proud UC alum and an old friend of Penn, so it's always a pleasure to be with you all, and good to see you again, Spoma. So as you said, we've been working on this issue I primarily work on it from a litigation perspective, but I have colleagues in the ACLU who are communications and advocacy professionals who have been dealing with these issues in a variety of different ways. But I think I'll focus, as I said, as you mentioned, on the legal lines. And I have to say that, while I am a First Amendment attorney, I think the Constitution is very important. It has a lot to say on these issues. To only focus on the constitutional question is to focus in on one small piece of a much bigger discussion about sort of why these movements are happening, how we should be responding to them as a culture and as a society. And where they may be making missteps or not. So I'll focus on the constitutional legal framework, but I have to name the fact that that's just one small piece of what is interesting about what's going on right now. So, with regard to the First Amendment, it only applies to government action, right? The First Amendment is a restriction on the government's authority to regulate private speech. So that's an important note to start with, because it means that as a fundamental principle, the First Amendment applies to public universities, but in general, not to private ones. That's an important distinction, and many private universities, express their adherence to free speech principles. There's Leonard Law in California that essentially applies First Amendment protections on private college campuses. But when we're thinking about the regulation of protests and what can and can't be done to regulate speech and protest on campuses, when we're talking about the police, that we're always talking about state action. But when we're talking about university punishment or any other sorts of university-based actions, it does matter under the First Amendment, whether it's a public university or private university as a general principle. But I'll focus in on two specific First Amendment issues that have been coming up a lot, which is one, the right to protest, but also academic. So we know that student activism has historically played an incredibly important role in our democracy, not just our democracy, but countries worldwide, from the anti-apartheid movement to the civil rights movement that Greg was talking about. You name it, students have been at the forefront of progress and change in so many instances. So we think it's important, as the ACLU for over 100 years, we've been fighting to make sure that the right to protest is protected, because without the ability to call the people in power to account, we think that our democracy will gravely suffer. So we think it's important to have the most robust protections for the right to protest, and robust protections for academic freedom, so that we can have the broadest variety of ideas cultivated in our colleges and universities. And so most of what we end up doing is trying to push back against efforts by government censors. And what government can do, what government cannot do ever, is regulate based on viewpoint, right? Is say we will allow some kinds of speech that we like, but not the speech that we don't like. But that's not to say that there's nothing the government can do to regulate protests, right? You may have heard of time, place, and manner restrictions. So the government generally can impose content neutral restrictions on the time, place, and manner of protests. So they can't say we like this protest, but we don't like that protest, but they can say you can only protest in this area in these hours if you're going to use amplification, regulating the time, the place, and the manner of the protest without any regard to whether it is a favored protest or disfavored protest or favored group or disfavored group, or whatever the message may be. So that's one thing to keep in mind, is when a government regulates speech, are they doing it on a content neutral basis? And are they enforcing neutral time, place, and manner restrictions? I'll come back to how that's showing up in the current context. Well, I'll just say that now. So when we have encampments, which is sort of the most controversial, noteworthy tactic being used right now on college campuses, many folks have pointed out that there are legitimate, constitutionally sound regulations that a university, whether private or public, can impose, saying that you're not allowed to sleep in the middle of, you're not allowed to set up structures and sleep in the middle of our campus indefinitely, right? That is the kind of content neutral time, place, and manner restriction that universities and even government agencies will generally be allowed to enforce. So on that level, encampments, strictly speaking, are generally not going to be protected speech under the First Amendment. We've seen that described by many commentators as the lawlessness of these protests. And while I think protesters should not be surprised that they will not be left undisturbed permanently in encampments, I think actually many of the protesters who are engaging in these things know full well that they're breaking the rules and are happy to suffer, not happy, but are expecting to suffer the consequences, which is the definition of civil disobedience, which is what you mentioned earlier, right? Civil disobedience is the intentional breaking of a rule or a law to prove a moral, ethical, or legal point, right? And to suffer those consequences, often publicly. Civil disobedience has a long and honorable history in our country. It has been used to great effect to garner support for a variety of causes over the course of our history and in other countries as well. And a key piece of civil disobedience is the photo of the person being arrested and getting into the back of the police car, right? That is a part of the point. So civil disobedience does not mean immunity from consequences. It means that you are going to break a law in order to highlight a broader injustice. And so it's not to say that civil disobedience is inappropriate or whatever, but just because it's called civil disobedience, seems like some people feel like that means that it's therefore legitimate and therefore should not be punished in any way, shape, or form. That's sort of one universe of misunderstanding of these lines. I think equally important, at least on the other side, is, okay, let's say this is a reasonable time, place, and manner restriction. And let's say these protesters have crossed a line of one sort or another. Now, what is the appropriate response? Right? It is not the case that any infraction, any unlawful activity, any violation of any university policy should immediately lead to the most draconian measures. We've seen on several campuses that, Greg described in vivid detail the events at Kent State, but we've seen police called into multiple campuses at this point, including multiple instances of pretty shocking violence. And so we have made clear as the ACLU that for the police to be called in, it should be an absolute last resort, only when there is a real threat to security. But that's not to say that the university must leave these protesters undisturbed otherwise, right? So we can hold two things in our minds at the same time. Just because the encampment is peaceful doesn't mean it's protected by the First Amendment. And just because it isn't protected by the First Amendment, if they're being peaceful, a violent law enforcement response is generally going to be inappropriate, except as a very last resort. Maybe I'll stop there. I can go on and on and on, but I'll stop there, Selma, and let you jump back in.
Well, thank you. And I think, and we have some questions from the audience, so that's great. But before we do, I just have one follow-up question. So when students break the rules, whether it's time, place, and manner, or or something else, let's call it at a public institution. I mean, not just because maybe more First Amendment things, but is the recourse really coming from the administrators? I mean, are they going to, I know civil disobedience, you might be hauled to jail, but let's say that we don't go that far. Do students retain any legal rights when they break the rule of the time, place, manner, and some other ones that the institution might set up?
It's a great question. And of course, the lawyerly answer is that it depends. But I can go beyond that. In one example, it's not in the higher education context, but more common in the walkouts in K-12 schools. What we would say there is that if you are participating in a walkout, again, whether that's in K-12 or in higher ed, I think, you may be subject to punishment for having missed class, right? If your school tabulates absences, you will probably be marked absent, and you don't really have a great argument that you shouldn't be marked absent. But you should not be suspended just because it was for a protest, right? You can be punished for breaking whatever rule it was in a proportion to whatever the normal punishment is for breaking that rule. But you can't be punished more severely just because there was a political message behind it. That makes sense.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. That I think that's good. That's helpful for us to think about. So, all right. Some of questions that we got surround this notion of outside agitator. And I think, Greg, you mentioned that at Kent State. And actually, we hear this now, too, with some of these campus things. Oh, it's students aren't, it's these outside organizers who are coming in and the students are pawns, or this sort of thing. So is the claim of outside agitator legitimate? It seems to be one that throughout history is used quite frequently, but can you say more about them and why that might be being used, and how we might respond to it?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, absolutely. It was used quite a bit, as many folks probably know, certainly during the civil rights movement in the South. Where various police authorities claimed that this was the work of outside agitators coming in and disturbing the community, et cetera, et cetera. So it's definitely it's got a long politically charged history, that phrase. And then of course it was used in the context of the Cold War, right, with the student left, the new left, SDS, that these are, communist sympathizers, they're outside agitators, coming into campus communities, leading on or agitating or plotting to do all kinds of things to students who were otherwise not listen to something like that, right? So it's an idea that, our campus would never do X, right? It's these other people who are coming in. Of course, it's not to say there weren't, activists, right, in that era, but the fact is that the dissent, right, whether it was civil disobedience or peaceful protest or whatever it might be, was generated, by students, right, at the campus. For the most part, they were students who were there leading it, doing it. So, and it's then used, the term outside agitator, as often as an excuse to then use some kind of excessive force, let's say, right, or great force against a group of students who are engaged in whatever type of protest it is. So yeah, it's a politically charged term that has very little, a little bit of truth, but not much, to then justify these actions, which at Kent and other places like that. Yeah,
Right.
and in the South, right, in the civil rights movement especially.
Right. Yes. What the institution or law enforcement may call outside agitators or community members, oftentimes the people involved call solidarity, right? People coming to and
Right,
joining and right,
yeah. Yeah,
yeah.
and I think
So
back, to something, I won't get it exactly right, but something that Martin Luther King said, right, is that, we're all citizens of the United States. So if someone's from California or Arkansas or New York and they happen to be here, they can be here, right? There's no law against somebody wanting to come as a citizen, right, of the nation to be part of something. And so that, he had I think, a very eloquent way of kind of thinking about it, just to build on what you just said. Yeah.
yeah. Okay, thank you. Yeah. So okay, there's so many good questions coming in on it. I'm going, oh my God, we're going to get to all of them. So Emerson, maybe this issue of viewpoint discrimination, and when does it bump up against intimidation, right? I mean, some people are calling the just the physical encampment itself is a form of intimidation. Different symbols that are being used, different phrases that are being used. And so, I think campuses are struggling with how do we allow for free speech and yet not have a hostile environment for our students. So there's what would you say?
It's complicated. It's a very difficult area of emerging law. This juxtaposition of the First Amendment and anti-discrimination law is highly contested. In part, I have to say it's a bit of a digression, but in part because of the weaponization of anti-discrimination law by people who have traditionally been very against anti-discrimination law, now trying to use anti-discrimination law to protect white Christian Republican mainstream type of ideas. So I will say that this sort of how anti-discrimination law is being used to undercut or support First Amendment values is cutting in all sorts of different directions in confusing ways right now. But as a general matter, the universities are obligated under free speech principles and the First Amendment to protect free speech, including speech that can be offensive, right? Just because somebody is offended by it, that's not enough under the First Amendment to say that it should be prohibited, because we want to protect a wide variety of viewpoints, in particular on a college campus, where we want to have a high degree of freedom for people to explore new ideas and to challenge traditional wisdom. At the same time, under federal anti-discrimination law, Title VI, Title IX, Title VII, the universities must act when there is harassment that creates a hostile educational environment. So not all speech is protected, right? So there are certain categories of unprotected speech, like true threats, defamation, speech that's incidental to criminal activity, sort of planning a criminal activity is speech that can be punished, and speech that creates a hostile environment can be punished as well. So what is the definition of a hostile environment? Excuse me, but I'll just read the definition. It's unwelcome conduct based on a protected characteristic that's subjectively and objectively offensive and so severe or pervasive that it limits or denies a person's ability to participate in or benefit from the educational program. So unwelcome, based on a protected characteristic, offensive, and so severe or pervasive that it denies their ability to participate. So how does this all play out in the context of a campus, protest or encampment? The expression of a view that someone might find offensive by itself is not enough, as we said, provided that someone is following time, place, and manner restrictions, provided that it is just a political view, even if it's obnoxious, even if it's racist, even if it's anti-Semitic even. Where it becomes a hostile educational environment is when it becomes targeted, when it prevents someone from enjoying the educational environment. So we can imagine there are hard border cases, right? So the example that was, I don't know if you said this out loud, but the example that was put to me in the chat included sort of hateful or anti-Semitic things being said in an encampment and students passing by, and can they claim that they're in a hostile educational environment for having to pass by the encampments? I think this is a hard case, but I think, you know, simply having to pass by people you disagree with, I think we would hesitate to say that on an isolated basis by itself creates a hostile educational environment. But it's not a black and white situation, right? If someone is shouting at someone individually, if they're threatening that person, if it's day after day after day, so severe or pervasive, there are ways in which one could imagine that fact pattern really leading to a hostile educational environment. So again, the answer is it depends, but that's the general framework: is you protect viewpoints even if they're offensive, but not if they create a hostile educational environment such that they're so severe or pervasive that someone can't benefit from the environment. And exactly where that line meets is a tricky one. And I'll just say one more note. Sorry to go on for a long time, but I think it's important to say, because this is for this audience, many of whom are university administrators and officials, that space between what must be protected and what must be prohibited has shrunk. This is something that another UC fellow, Brian Suchek, has written about. But basically, in order to try to curtail anti-discrimination law, there has been a multi-year effort to try to say that all of these obnoxious views that are being punished by schools are protected, and schools can't even call someone in and explain that they may have hurt some folks' feelings. And I think this is a really key point, because when all this talk about constitutional lines, what you can do, what you cannot do, what often gets lost is all of the ways in which a campus community, can and must respond and heal in response to these really difficult times. And so I think what's important is that there has to be space for a university to say, listen, what you said may not be unprotected speech, and it may not have even created a hostile educational environment, but we are here to help you learn and grow, and therefore we're going to address this conduct, and we're going to try to see if we can change behaviors and norms on our campus. And what universities have run into is saying, oh no, you're violating that person's free speech just by calling them in for a conversation. So I think as a key part of this defining of what can be permitted and what must be prohibited is we have to protect that space in the middle where universities can address behavior that is problematic, even if it's technically constitutionally protected.
Right. So this being attentive to the ethical aspects of our speech, that, you know, maybe we need to think about some of those things. I'm looking at the time. We still have time, but I want to reserve one question about what can we do, right? What should faculty do, administrators do that would be positive? Before we get to that one, though, because it's come up a lot, let's tackle this issue of social media. What role is it playing? How is it, you know, is it escalating what otherwise would have been a little bit, you know, more low key? Surveillance, law enforcement, has at their hands all kinds of surveillance measures, and maybe they know what's going on. Are they waiting too long? Or, what's happening? Or what are your thoughts on the impact of social media that students have access to, but also administrators and law enforcement? And you may have all read about this recently, the Chronicle of Higher Education. We found out a professor, he's being recorded routinely, and that the UNC Chapel Hill says, yeah, we have the right to do that, to check, what you're saying. So I think people are very wary, right, about both what they put out there, what information they get. Do you think that's playing a role any differently today than maybe media did in the past? Or, is it different? I guess fundamentally different.
I guess I'll take the past one. Emerson, maybe you can take the current stuff, although we can certainly offer our opinions, right, on both of those. But yeah, just thinking back, to the case of Kent, but other places as well. the place of rumor, right, was such a big part, I think, of what was going on. In a situation where you lack understanding, you lack information, you lack knowledge about what's happening, rumors can sort of come in there and really grow and accelerate as people try to make sense of what's going on. So in the case of what happened at Kent, as I mentioned, there were rumors spreading, throughout that period. What's kind of tragic and sad about it too is that the university established a rumor control center to try to stop all of that. But as one of our narrators said, who was a faculty member part of that, it actually ended up spreading more rumors than it stopped. So it wasn't particularly effective. In that era, you had word of mouth, you had radio, you had newspapers, right? That's kind of how, and flyers, the numerous flyers everywhere. And so you had a limited way, I guess, to get your word out about what was happening, what wasn't happening. And in that vacuum of information, I think is where those rumors spread and led to fear, led to anxiety and anxiousness. So I think the difference now, right, is that the platforms are larger and have the power to spread misinformation, disinformation, and accurate information, right? All of it in a much greater and obviously much faster way, right? So anything that happens, in one spot instantly, right, can be portrayed across the globe in less than a second. And again, the fact that we've kind of drifted right into this period of polarization means there's this information bubble, right, where we're getting stuff from one spot, not from others, and operating accordingly. So, and I think that all that, I think, obviously plays into whatever reactions happen right on campus with these issues. So, but I do think there is that ability, right, of social media to accelerate situations, perhaps in ways that maybe didn't exist, 50, 60 years ago a little bit. So Emerson, do you want to, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that assessment of the situation and what's different. There's unprecedented opportunity for solidarity and mobilization and spreading of information, and also for, as you said, misinformation and doxing and surveillance of different kinds. I guess the only thing I would add is that the ACLU's a lot of our work on my particular team. I'm on the speech, privacy, and technology team. So we deal a lot with the sort of intersection of free speech as well as privacy concerns and sort of digital privacy. And I would just say that it's important to note that many of the efforts to try to address these negative implications of social media themselves have deep problems in terms of speech and privacy. So efforts to crack down on misinformation in general require the government to decide what statements are true and what statements are not true, which is a problem. I used to work in Tanzania, where there was a Government Statistics Act, which said that essentially any facts shared on social media was combined with the cybercrimes law, which basically said that if you're going to state a fact on social media, it must be approved by the Government Statistics Office to verify that it is not spreading misinformation. So the and we can, it's Tanzania, it's not the United States, but the slippery slope is clear when you're trying to crack down on misinformation. And you're trying to sort out people who are mistaken and people who are vehemently mistaken from people who are actively lying. And I think that is a very, very, very difficult thing to entrust the government to try to figure out. Similarly, doxing is something that can be really difficult for those who are experiencing it. And it generally includes the widespread sharing of publicly available information, which is hard to crack down on from a legal perspective. You can do various kinds of digital hygiene to make sure that you're not, your passwords and everything are secure. But the truth is, a quick Google search can get a lot of information that can easily be used by people who would like to get in touch with you and say mean things to you. So doxing is horrible, it's terrible, and the legal sort of remedies are limited. And finally, in terms of surveillance, while we are fighting tooth and nail to push back against pervasive surveillance by the state, it is much, much, much harder for us in private settings, in a private university, in other private settings, to argue that surveillance must be curtailed under constitutional principles. Sometimes we are successful, sometimes we're able to do it, but it's just to highlight, I totally agree that social media has this positive and this negative, and efforts to adjust the negative side are themselves extremely fraught.
Can I
Yeah.
add one thing? Spoma, just maybe something you said, Emerson, and you said also, thinking back to the era of the Vietnam era, the role of television, right? In showing the war to the American public was a brand new thing in that era. And I think that had a really powerful effect on public opinion of the war, the conduct, politicians, all of that sort of thing. So, and we saw that in the first Iraq war, right, in 1991, how much the government tried to kind of quell, right, media attention on what was happening in Iraq and Kuwait. And so I think that was a really powerful moment and something to think about as well, how those visual images, right, can affect things one way or the other and are very powerful, with context or without, right? We know the power of image can be quite profound. And the second thing I would just to remind folks as well is when you talk about a little bit about surveillance, right? In the 1960s, the FBI had a famous program, right, COINTELPRO, where they, were on surveillance against civil rights groups, labor groups, leftist groups, the Klan, right? And they had operatives, right, throughout all of these groups during this whole period. So the surveillance aspect, right, of campus protest, student protest, or other groups too, as I mentioned, the Klan and others, that dates back, right, at least until, J. Edgar Hoover, right, in the FBI in the 1960s. And again, as Emerson said, it's grown obviously, right, a lot since then, that component. So just a couple things.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, nothing new. And, we want all of us, I think, on here are about free speech and advancing that. And yet there have been plenty of obstacles, as we said. So we are coming quickly to the end of this hour, and it does seem like the right time to say, how can faculty and administrators, I don't want to say intervene, but be involved in ways to help the situation. So, as somebody who has studied and worked with student activists, it's been a long time since they're going to just throw themselves out in the street, and play dead, and do a die-in or something without thinking through. That did happen. But now I think what we're seeing, our students are very strategic, right? They're researching, they're crafting arguments, they're drafting campaign materials, they're writing materials to the board, they're doing all kinds of things in addition to some of these more elaborate displays, right, of encampments and some of the other protest actions. So it's not that that's the first thing most of them are doing. So it seems to me something in there, maybe we're working with what can we do? What ought we to do to ensure that students are active citizens and remain active, who express dissent, and yet we have the conversations that we need, not just for now, but of course going into the fall. We're going to be hitting election season, and we're going to have more and more of this kind of activity. We can anticipate more and more of this activity. What suggestions do you have for faculty and administrators? Either one of you can start.
All right, Emerson, I'll start unless you want to. Okay. Yeah, just I mean, I think Spona, that's really interesting what you said there about that shift, right, and how things are done. Yeah, I think, as a faculty member, I see my job again, like you said, to encourage, right, that activism, encourage that involvement. It's funny you said that, because I was just reading a paper by a student who was talking about the fact that, Gen Z, right, it was the focus of the paper, about, the decline or lack of activism, lack of interest in politics and getting involved. And maybe, these issues with the war, which is the kind of the impetus of this panel, but other things as well, maybe that's going to change. I don't know. But just trying to encourage that involvement, to get there, to have that speech, right, and with all the parameters we discussed. I think that's, our job is to try to do that. I would hope that our administrators would also be on board, right, with encouraging, you know, an open dialogue again, in the ways we've discussed already in this panel. You know, my concern is that, you know, what I've seen in many of the coverage of the current round of protests is that, you know, it's not only students that are being bullied, let's say, right, in these cases, but it's faculty too, right? And again, that was not really something you saw in the 1960s and 70s, right? Faculty were kind of, you know, allowed to kind of be out there to try to, you know, get involved and quell the issue, right? And seen in that sort of way. Again, that's a shift, right? Which I mentioned earlier about where we are with higher ed. So I'm trying to be hopeful to my students and myself, but I'm seeing some trends that are troubling, and I'm hoping that, you know, we can use this moment to really think deeply and carefully about, you know, what Emerson said earlier about what our academic environments are all about, what we should be about, and try to encourage us to maintain that, you know, even in the wake of tension and stress as we are seeing right now, to not throw out that foundation of speech and learning and ideas. So there you go. Emerson, throw it to you.
Sure, thank you. And I'll just say quickly, I mean, I think in the wake of this school year, a lot of campuses are going to need a lot of healing. And so that is going to be a sort of non-legal, non-constitutional process of sort of listening to each other and coming back together as a campus community. I think for faculty and administrators, one important thing is to really create clear norms at the outset to the greatest extent possible. It's not always possible to anticipate every development. But if there's a theme among schools where things went more smoothly versus less smoothly, it was the places where the leaders established very clearly what they would do, and that not only that they announced it, but what they said was reasonable and legitimate. And so I think the value of setting out those clear norms at the outset is extremely strong. But the most important thing, I think, is having people be continuing to be open about this whole process. It's not going away anytime soon. And I think in the midst of all of it, it can be very disheartening and very discouraging. But just remembering that people can and do change their minds and behaviors is the one bit of hope that I try to hold on to.
Yeah, that is a very hopeful message. And I want to leave you with one more, because some students at Trinity College in Dublin staged their own encampment. It was over in 5 days, and they got some great negotiations and concessions. But the thing that really stuck with me is a student there. He goes by Ben. That's not his real name. He says he walks through campus differently now after being part of this encampment that had donations, that had all kinds of things. He said, there's a shift in the way I view our campus. It's no longer just a university and a monolith, but it's an active space where we affected change and made history. I think students want to make their mark in the world. They're speaking out, and the ways that we can help them and preserve an environment that's healthy and vibrant and growing and listening. That's our mission, I think, as administrators, as faculty, as people of the world, right? Thank you all for being here. Big thanks to the UC National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement and PEN America for pulling this topic together that is on the top of our minds. And good luck to all of you in managing the issues that come before you. And let's stay open to listening to those students. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Bye-bye.